Greetings all, and welcome back to our Traveler's Guide 2. Our examination of the BSL research station prior to our trip to Vuros gave us the opportunity to see the effects of the presence of the X-Parasite aboard a vessel and the sheer chaos and destruction that it could cause in such a location. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg when it came to what these monsters could really do to make the lives of others a terrifying nightmare to handle in more ways than one. Following that, we will be looking now into the most recent of events to have taken place in the legacy of not just the X and the Hunter, but also the Chozo as they are known, as we will now be diving into the tragedy of what could happen when these monsters had an entire planet to infect, as we begin our examination of Planet ZDR, the last home for these creatures and the Makan Chozo tribe, starting with this first segment, a traveler's guide to Artaria. Before we dive right into the deepest underground part of Planet ZDR, let's take a look at the planet itself and a brief history of the events that had transpired there prior to its destruction. Planet ZDR was the original homeworld of the Makan Chozo tribe, and its existence had been unknown to most of the galaxy before transmissions from it were sent to the Galactic Federation in recent times. This world was once a thriving home for countless Chozo, having conquered and transformed the interior of the planet to use it for military purposes, including the construction of several research and experimentation stations and worship centers for the Chozo in their time there. While it served as an outpost for the military of the Makan tribe for some, and was left as the only stronghold of the Chozo race after the attacks to space parts in Planet ZDR, it seemed to be perfectly safe, especially under the control of the tribe's leader, Ravenbeak. However, this all fell into despair when an X-Parasite disguised as a fellow Chozo soldier bordered with the remainder of Ravenbeak's forces after he led his tribe to almost completely wipe out the more peaceful Thor tribe on SR-388. This resulted in almost the entirety of the Chozo forces being wiped out, and Ravenbeak was forced to construct Elan to quarantine and seal off the parasites so they would not escape and infect the rest of the planet. Though Ravenbeak had planned to use Metroids as a military force like so many others, the destruction of the Metroids as a whole by the Hunter rendered this impossible, seemingly dashing his hopes entirely. However, a transmission from Elan to the Galactic Federation showing the survival of the X-Parasites led them to send a series of ME robots to investigate the planet and the signal, only for them to also vanish, leading the Federation to send in the Hunter to investigate what had happened. The Hunter was confronted by Ravenbeak as she first arrived on the planet, and was damaged severely by him, removing most of her physical powers and leaving her a shell of her former self. She eventually learned that the robots had been taken control of under Ravenbeak's command, leading her to explore the facilities and lands within ZDR's crust, destroying the rogue machines and regaining her abilities as she explored more of the planet, eventually coming across the zone called Elan. It was here that she discovered the X-Parasites had indeed survived, and with her arrival, Ravenbeak decided to release them onto the planet, infecting and killing most everything present, and in turn forcing the Hunter into fights against the parasites once more. When she managed to eventually find and confront Ravenbeak himself, he proved to still be too much for her to handle, and made it known that his intention in all of his actions was to take the Hunter's genetic material as she was fully powered up, and use it to create an army of mutant Metroid clones. However, when seemingly in the grasp of a certain end, the Hunter's Metroid powers fully awakened and turned her into a human Metroid, granting her the power she needed to destroy Ravenbeak entirely. In his death, however, a self-destruct sequence was activated, and with a bit of assistance from the seemingly deceased Quiet Robe, or at the very least the X-Parasite that had come to inhabit his body, she was able to escape the planet before it detonated, destroying the last known home of the Chozo and truly rendering them extinct as a race. Now that we have the general history of the last known events to occur on Planet ZDR, it's time to start looking at its individual locales, starting with Artaria. As a small note though, we will not be going over the different ME models found in this locale or any other just yet. They will be saved for a separate analysis altogether as a result of their unique powers, designs, and the challenges they provide the Hunter in her attempt to outrun and eventually destroy them to acquire the powers equipped to the different models. Out of all the sub-locations within Planet ZDR, Artaria is the deepest that shows former occupation by the Chozo, and is a rocky, sandy world with some bodies of water and even waterfalls, though it is also known to be exceptionally cold and mostly cavernous in its form, with very few places where light of any sort can shine through to see the land that lies within it, as well as the creatures that have come to occupy it, including some specialty reptiles and amphibians that have otherwise become perfectly adapted to the chilly rocky landscape. The area is directly connected to Cataris above it, and this shows quite prominently, as the upper parts of Artaria are much warmer than the rest, with pockets of magma being seen in its uppermost reaches. This is the area the Hunter first found herself in after surviving Ravenbeak's initial attack on her when she arrived on ZDR. She was hunted by 2 enemy robots here, the first of which was badly damaged and the latter of which granted her the Spider Magnet upgrade, and she was able to use her skills to kill the Corpius monster to gain access to the Phantom Cloak to traverse further enemy zones with at least some semblance of protection. With all this now established, let's examine some of the minor creatures that can be found frequently within Artaria. The deer is the name given to an unknown fleshy creature seen roaming various parts of Planet ZDR, and it is not entirely certain how it was best classified outside of being very mammal-like in their anatomy. These beasts had a pink hairless body form that walked around on 4 legs that each ended in a black jointed claw that allowed them to dig into and gain traction even on hard rock, further possessing a small stubby tail, long neck and ovoid head, with a small mouth lined with flat teeth for grinding plant matter. These creatures lacked anything in the way of eyes, relying on a series of hidden sensory organs near the front of their face that detected sound, using that as a form of navigation in place of vision. They are typically harmless creatures that traverse in small groups, feeding on low-lying plant matter for sustenance, and in general being a total non-threat to all of the denizens of ZDR. They tend to be extremely skittish and thus usually stay out of the way of larger life forms, recognized as being quite docile, in turn making them some of the few creatures on the planet that were unlikely to get in the way of explorers. Sadly, this means they are often the choice prey item for creatures like the plant eater, but they were able to reproduce rapidly, and thus served as a vital link in the food web and overall ecosystem of ZDR, where the environment wasn't too hot for them to handle. Parts of ZDR were once home to a unique species of blue butterfly, whose vibrant coloration was not an inherent property, and instead seemed to be a direct byproduct of their diet. These delicate creatures, though often traveling in large swarms, did not pose a threat to other life forms in any meaningful way, and were rarely ever seen as prey as well, as the small forms offered little in the way of viable nutrition. What makes them noteworthy, however, is that they primarily dined on the energy given off by Chozo tech, in particular the control units found in various parts of ZDR. This is what gave them the bright blue glow, and while they could process this energy readily, they could not do much with it otherwise, and thus were not seen as a serious threat problem. Even so, they were not without their uses, as they often did congregate near where Chozo weapons and upgrades were, or at the very least where they may have been at one time. As such, they could serve as a handy exploration marker for those looking through any area that may have once held Chozo tech of any sort, helping to mark out where others might be able to find something of great value in that regard. Rods were a unique and not widely understood group of insectoid entities that had forgone the need for legs in any way, instead possessing a trio of paired wings that allowed them to flutter through the air at both exceptional speeds and with great maneuverability. The thin profile of the form made it possible for them to live fairly calm and simple lives, feeding on smaller insectoids and dew that would collect on cavern walls and ceilings for sustenance. While they might not have had much in the way of power to make them even remotely harmful towards others, it is known that their tendency to travel in large groups could make them an annoyance, as their sharp teeth could rasp and wear away even stone with time. Though for armored explorers, this would rarely ever be an issue, and they were usually more of a candidate for photography than anything to be seriously afraid of. And from here, we can now move on to the real threats in this locale. Creeps were a type of gastropod that thrived in the colder reaches of Planet ZDR, and were among the most common of organisms that could be found in these places, especially Artaria. These brown beasts had a soft, gelatinous body that they moved around on, using a thick mucus-like secretion on the lower bodies, allowing them to slowly crawl across surfaces and even stick to walls and ceilings because of the sticky properties of said mucus. They used a trio of glowing yellow eyes to detect basic light and darkness, as they had no need for more advanced vision systems in the lower reaches of their planetary home. Creeps mainly fed on moss and other types of small plants and funguses that could thrive in colder environments, and for the most part, they were completely non-aggressive and tended to leave other creatures alone, only being a direct threat if contact was made, as the mucus they secrete over their bodies made them slightly corrosive to touch. Other than this, however, their soft bodies were completely vulnerable to attack and could be breached with basic firepower of any sort, making them an easy target. Thankfully, they rarely ever had to worry about direct attack from predators, as the mucus-laden bodies were both corrosive, as mentioned above, and had toxic flesh that could make anything that tried to eat them violently ill, thus earning the spot within threat level alpha. Clader were a type of terrestrial mutant, whose exact biological classification is not entirely certain, as they shared physical attributes with both birds in their bone and facial structure, and insectoids in the way that they reproduced. These creatures had a blackish-red outer hide and walked on 4 sharp pointed appendages for legs, able to move along flat surfaces with little trouble. While the red eyes and dark hide might have made them seem fitting for the dark caverns of Artaria, they also stood out as a result of the bright orange sacs that sprouted from their back. These sacs were actually biological batteries that the creatures used to break down digested ores and metals from beneath the surface to generate energy, allowing them to live comfortably in the otherwise sparsely vegetated lower reaches of ZDR. These beasts were fairly placid by nature and did not show aggression outwardly, only attacking with their pointed appendages if they were directly struck by another creature, and thus could be easy to avoid, though they were known to become much more aggressive if they were under the control of the next parasite. Their hides were also relatively soft and did not show much in the way of resilience against any type of basic weaponry, rendering them little more than a minor threat that could easily be destroyed with even basic firepower or even ignored altogether, and thus best fit within threat level Alpha.
Believe it or not, I have been experimenting with artificial replications of the orange sacs on the back to use the form of organic lighting. Not only are they perfect for disposing of ore waste and other materials that most of the creatures cannot handle outside the digestive system, but the light glow they radiate in the presence of breaking everything down could work as a low-grade light source that's just enough for illuminating the surroundings in total darkness. It might be a bit much to some, but organic lighting such as this can still be cheaper in the long run than artificial lighting. What? Don't judge me here. Not every project I look into has to be a weapon or some other dangerous tool. Science can be practical too, you know.
The Ply was a type of unknown organism that shared biological traits with mollusks and insectoids and lived within some of the deeper parts of ZDR, though their bodies were able to handle different extremes in temperature and were thus more widespread than might be initially apparent. These simple beasts had a large, massive ocular organ that served as their brain, eye, and digestive system, all packed into a small form, with the rest of their bluish-white bodies being dominated by a pair of thick, fleshy wings they used to fly and a short, barbed tail. These creatures usually traveled in small groups with few members and flitted about targets before dive-bombing them with their tails, not unlike a war wasp, hoping to use their sharpened tail ends to pierce into a target, while the spines from the tail rip out flesh as the tails are pulled out, with a clump of meat attached to them that they can use for sustenance. While this attack was often efficient enough for them to get by with little issue in the native habitats, the attack could be physically countered with the right timing to stun them mid-flight, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. Even so, their small compact body forms and their capacity to move quickly through the air could make these beasts hard to track and thus made it easier for them to use small numbers to overwhelm larger opponents, and this was necessary for them, as their fleshy bodies were relatively unarmored and readily damaged by basic weapon fire. This could potentially make them a nuisance to deal with, but weapons with a widespread pattern could make short work of them and render them little more than a minor inconvenience for more heavily armed life forms, and thus best fit within threat level Alpha.
To be family flower buggers, or finders keep their rolling at some sort of Disney movie or something. Nice able friendly beast and no little fireball I can't handle. I like to hang out with friends using tag team tactics and solid players like you and me. Yeah guys, I'm day time will enjoy yourself in a nice cool place like this. Shit's on real. Really feel like I need more vacation time.
The members of the Dropter family of creatures on ZDR were mammal-like beasts that spent much of their time in the air, devouring small floating organisms and whatever other prey they likely could effectively hunt from the air. Dropters had a beige underbelly to their form, with large white wings that served as their only appendages, a purple back with luminescent green stripes across their wings and spine, and a large 3-part hard beak that was normally hidden, only being exposed when they went in for an attack. They had a very crude rudimentary eye system that is hidden near their mouth, and mainly relied on basic light and shadows to find potential targets. When these creatures spotted a potential meal in front of them, they would rear back and dive bomb their target, attacking with a fierce bite from their exposed mouthparts. This sort of attack could be deflected with a melee counter to stun them and leave them exposed to attack, but this is rarely an issue for those that encountered them, as their bodies are relatively thin and flimsy, easily being repelled and destroyed with even basic gunfire. Despite this, Dropters had managed to adapt to a number of different environments within the homeworld of ZDR, with at least 2 main variants existing within the confines of the planet, and thus could be a common sight for most explorers, occupying a niche within threat level Alpha. Infestors and fulmites belong to a small group of insect-like creatures known for using chemical warfare as their primary means of defense and hunting. In the case of infestors, these black-purple creatures walked on floors, walls, and ceilings, using a series of tiny sharp claws on the front parts of their body that could dig into rocky surfaces and cling to them easily, making it possible for them to lug their bodies along just about any sort of natural environment. They were easily recognized not just by the series of green glowing eyes that adorn the front of their body, but also their large bloated posterior, which is where they made themselves a nuisance. These beasts tended to feed on small, inconsequential life forms they came across as they moved around the habitat, but if they spot a potential prey item that is normally too large for them to directly handle, or a larger creature that may have been a potential threat, they would use a sac contained in the posterior to generate and release a sticky ball of acid that bounce along solid surfaces for a short time before bursting, dealing damage from initial contact as well as leaving a cloud of acid for a short period of time in the impact area. These balls could be destroyed with basic weapon fire, and infestors themselves were not the most durable of creatures, but they could still be a noble threat to deal with and best kill from afar before they could fire off anything corrosive, even if this was enough to elevate them past threat level Alpha.
The acid used by these species as a weapon is actually of great interest to me. I've been wondering how it is that our ilk never had the idea of using acid as a chemical weapon of any sort, with all the other tech we've managed to hoard and take hold of over the years. Sure, it is true that it's not exactly ideal for most close-quarters fights, and laser weapons and explosives are a lot more reliable and act much faster, but the acidic properties of this monster can actually melt through weaker armor quite readily. Moreover, I bet that I could concentrate the acid to make it a devastating weapon for eating through more heavily armored beasts and removing said armor from the equation entirely, making them more vulnerable to attack. Sadly, as can be expected with something like this, not everyone is as thrilled by the idea as I am. True, it is a caustic hazard, and our former ilk weren't always super careful, and some might have used it as a prank and hurt someone. Actually, upon further thought, maybe there's a simpler and more frustrating reason why we never implemented acid-based weapons at all. Morons.
Ice fleas were a variant of dropters that had developed an extreme resistance against cold temperatures, to the point where their bodies had taken on a white color from ice crystals growing along their hide. These creatures behaved identically to their other counterparts, but while they did have even more advanced durability, even compared to sharp paws, the real threat they posed came from within their forms. If an ice flea was heavily damaged by a charged energy shot or missile, at low energy, they would begin to charge their bodies up with frigid energy and, in a final act of offense, would use a fast-acting chemical reaction internally that caused their bodies to violently burst, sending out a frigid wave of energy that could deal immense freezing damage to anything that got caught in the path of the burst. While it might have been easily blocked by walls or even by destroying the ice flea before it had a chance to detonate, this attack could nonetheless be fatal to most other creatures that did not share their resistance to cold, and thus served as a handy defense mechanism to keep the population numbers at a stable level, elevating them to a place within threat level Beta. The Caterzilla was a small grub-like creature with yellow form with a green center streak, grey outer shell, and beige underbelly, with tiny legs that are almost impossible to see when they were in motion. These beasts were extremely weak, their outer forms offering little in the way of direct defense despite the hardened grey shell on top, but this was of little concern to them, as they preferred to use numbers to their advantage to survive encounters with other creatures. These beasts fed on tiny insects in the rocks of Planet ZDR, and tended to form massive extensive colonies right below the surface of solid rock faces and even artificial structures, using a powerful acid secreted by their legs to create burrows and nests within such structures. Their nests tend to be easy to spot, as the melted remains of the surface formed a visible pit, and in order to move from one pit to another, they would come out of the holes in groups of 3 or 4 members and skitter across the surface quickly, being capable of climbing up just about any surface, before getting back to the other end and hiding themselves from view. This ensured that even hungry predators would only get one or a few of them at a time, allowing them to continue to thrive and reproduce elsewhere. The hard outer forms of these creatures and their acid-stained bodies could make direct contact with them damaging, but they were otherwise a non-aggressive threat, only injuring those that got in their way as they went about their daily life, and thus belonged in threat level Alpha. Tobio were small reptilian creatures that lived within the lower depths of ZDR and were mostly unseen in their normal lives, so they spent much of their time nesting inside of burrows in solid rock. These beasts used their extremely sharp, durable teeth to make narrow tunnels into rock floors and ceilings that they used to both locate and find essential minerals from ores they crunched with their teeth in order to survive, as well as provide them a place to hide from attacks by others. While it may have seemed odd for them to live in such a state that they were seemingly vulnerable to attack, in truth, these tunnels were built quite strategically on their part. Although their forms normally had a black, thin, scaly hide with rudimentary eyes in a thin, tapering form, when these creatures used their body muscles to propel themselves out of their current place in a rocky outcrop, they extended a pair of thin, green, membranous wings that allowed them to glide horizontally and not just vertically, the wings floating as soon as they approached a given tunnel in a different side of a rock face. This gave them a mobility advantage and made it harder for predators to catch them in the air or predict where they were going to go, with Tobio often making multiple burrows in order to throw off predators even more. However, this does not mean that their tactics were foolproof, as they often had to wiggle and scrunch their bodies before launching to restore elastic potential energy, creating a small dust cloud that was readily visible, and their bodies were fairly weak against direct attack, with even basic beam weapons being able to dispatch them in a single hit. Still, this life strategy seemed to work well for the Tobio, as they were present in large numbers in their native lands and seemingly never stopped coming out from the rocky homes as they moved between feeding and nesting spots, even if it can't elevate them past threat level Alpha. While clocks are normally not seen as much of a threat to explorers, it is known that after X-parasites infected nearly all the life forms on Planet ZDR during the Hunter's visit to the planet, X-parasite-infected versions of these creatures took on a new form known as the Spit Clock. These mutated X variants of the Sklock had a nearly identical anatomy as the normal variant, but their armor had turned a sickly lime green color, and there was a good reason why. This variant had been infused with genetic material from the acid-spitting Spittail, and as a result, their bodies constantly exuded a toxic mist that was designed to leave a cloud of acidic gas on the surface of the ground wherever and whenever they emerged from their burrows. This can make approaching them more difficult and a hazard for most, but at the very least, the acid clouds would dissipate at some time, though eliminating these mutants was not easy as it might have been otherwise, as they were also nobly more durable than normal counterparts and thus harder to eliminate with basic weaponry, best being placed within threat level Beta. Although the Armadigger could be a threat on its own, it is also noted that after the X-parasites infected nearly all the life forms on ZDR during the Hunter's visit to the planet, X-parasite-infected versions of these creatures took on a new form known as Takumaku. These creatures were effectively identical to Armadiggers in terms of behavior and mentality, but were noted for being capable of surviving in extremely cold environments, their bodies having turned a bluish-white color in such places and a dark gray color when outside of them, and were much more durable than normal counterparts. Even so, they could be countered and dealt with the same strategies used for Armadiggers, and thus showed little increased threat beyond that, still occupying the category of threat level Beta. The Auto was a type of small, semi-flat curved robot that is often paired with larger machines as a makeshift security system of sorts. These robots docked in special panels and walls within ME zones, where they were endlessly supplied with energy, and only ever left their docks, which themselves could be destroyed to prevent more Auto from being released, when they detected the presence of some sort of life form in the vicinity. These robots were not armed with any sort of weaponry aside from a weak energy shield that surrounded them and made them damaging to touch, but that is essentially the point of these machines. Using a series of thrusters on their back from the sides of these frames, these robots slowly moved around in set patterns and acted as a form of physical security for any enemy they were bonded with. When contact was made with an Auto, or when they were destroyed, they would let out an ultrasonic shriek that was imperceptible to most life forms, but was readily picked up by enemy robots, drawing them in instantly and making anything nearby a ready target. While they were packed with energy and could be destroyed for a large quantity of both energy and ammunition pickups, they are usually best avoided in order to keep them from alerting any enemy robots that might have otherwise been unaware of intruders within its midst. Even so, the otherwise had no real way to defend themselves directly, and thus are best placed within threat level Alpha.
The entire line of automatic drones of the chosen design, both here and on other worlds, may have just been the technological equivalent to turrets used by other races, but I have to say that they were a bit classier in design and overall versatility compared to what I've seen and documented throughout the cosmos. These drones, weapons or not, seem to have fairly advanced artificial programming that allows these machines, given the tools at their disposal, to interact with any living creature in a much more direct and hostile way in most instances, not just firing for the sake of defense, but doing so while actively hunting them down and making a nuisance out of themselves. As an example here, even if the odd tool itself doesn't really have any weapons attached to it, his body is armed not just with an energy charge that detonates upon direct contact with a living creature, but it alerts the smarter enemy robot in their lair to ensure that a creature that is crippled by their explosion is then dealt with severely if they somehow survive the blast. A simple function to be sure, but they follow variable flight paths in these actions, allowing them to smoke out anything within their field of operation with little issue. Sometimes the simplest of functions can be incredibly useful if you know how to use them to the fullest.
The Odd class was a semi-large machine of chosen design, whose exact purpose is not currently known, but was otherwise a severe threat worth taking notice of and avoiding if possible. Judging from its form, it is likely that it, like many of the machines of the Odd line, was made for defensive purposes, in their case eliminating small creatures that dwelled within the tight passageways and corridors of areas like Artaria and Cataris. While the Odd class size means that it could not enter into small passageways, it was more of a deterrent to large entities in their current state as it was, with large grey spherical metal bodies that traveled on sideways moving tank treads that could cling to rocky and metallic surfaces alike, enabling them to even travel on walls and ceilings despite their heavy forms. With a single large infrared sensor on the front of their bodies that made it easy for them to see through the otherwise thick hot air of their programmed defense routes, These machines travel along set pathways and usually were not aggressive unless something approached them. If this happened, Art class would raise two cylindrical arms that adorned their sides, normally bent up and over the sides of their head for more compact storage, and start to generate energy within them, the arms expanding in size like pistons in the process. At that moment, it is possible to stun these creatures with a melee counter in order to leave them vulnerable to attack, but if not, they would slam the lower ends of their piston-like arms into the ground, discharging the energy as a series of thermal energy waves that traveled in several columns along the surface they struck on both sides. These blasts were quite powerful and could deal an immense amount of damage to anything they touched, making Odd class dangerous enemies to confront without charged energy shots, those that could penetrate through metallic armor, or concussive missile weaponry, even if their set movement patterns could make it at least mildly easy to predict their movements and simply maneuver around them and out of harm's way, overall providing them with a place in threat level Gamma.
As much as one might think that outfitting machines with guns and energy weapons and the like is the noble and best way to go, you should never underestimate what can be done with the right sort of machinery in one's hands. The Art class is an excellent example of this, and should be taken notes on in turn. Having to get at least somewhat close to a target can make for tense times, and you really need to make sure your defending robot can even reach the target, but given the sheer downward crushing force that could be exhibited by the arms when they really went on the attack, not to mention the shockwaves they can also generate by striking harshly with their bodies, the enemy had a much better reach than you might think. Add to that decently heavy armor, and you've got a good example of true craftsmanship at its finest.
The Odd Sharp was a mobile drone built by the Chuzzle as a primitive but effective line of defense against those that otherwise seek to ransack the research lab and die run on Planet ZDR, among other locations. These machines were built into the floor of the research station on the planet and other locations, and consisted of a small central metallic core with a red thermal detector that was activated by a launcher built into said surfaces. And when this core was brought to the surface, a kinetic spinner on the main holder generated a magnetic energy field that rotated the core at high speeds, charging an energy core inside the device that triggered the generation and release of a series of sharp blue energy blades. When the charge was complete, the Odd Sharp was released, forward momentum created by the charge forcing the blade device to rocket forward across the ground, flying through the air even if it hits a gap, but otherwise crashing into walls and permanently deactivating if they did not hit anything else in the way. Much as with the Odd Sniper, floor panels near these devices and in the Odd Sharp itself used thermal energy to detect the identity of anything that got near them, firing these blade projectiles only if the target did not match anything in their given databases. The Odd Sharp, also like the Odd Sniper, was able to resist damage from basic beam weapons if they could not penetrate the hard metal bodies, and while they looked dangerous and could deal severe damage, powerful concussive weaponry like missiles could still eliminate them if needed. It is further interesting to note that if these machines were hit by the concussive force of a morph ball bomb, it would cause them to jump up much as the hunter would in morph ball form, potentially providing a way to stop them in their tracks and make it possible to get past them if pinned against the wall. Otherwise though, these bladed drones could prove to be a painful entity to get in the way of if you couldn't sidestep their aggressive attacks, and thus have a solid place within threat level beta. The Odd Sniper was also a mobile drone built by the Chuzzle as a primitive but effective line of defense against those that would otherwise seek to ransack the research bases on ZDR. These turrets had a small set of tank treads that exuded a magnetic charge that enabled them to freely move across whatever surface they were attached to, back and forth, without ever falling off of it, in turn allowing them to anchor themselves to floors, walls, and ceilings freely. Their metallic forms made it hard to penetrate and damage them with any sort of conventional beam weapon, making concussive weapons like missiles a choice weapon against them, though their armor demonstrated little resistance against energy weapons that could cut right through them like the plasma beam. As these machines rolled around to rotate their cannons on a 180-degree rotational joint for aiming purposes, they actively used a series of thermal motion tracking sensors on their gray and black bodies to search for potential threats, hooked up to a database that could make it possible for them to determine the identity of a target as soon as it entered into their field of vision. If they found something that was not a native life form otherwise allowed into their space, the central cannon on them would begin to charge up energy before firing it in the form of a powerful red laser beam that could cut through weaker life forms and deal notable damage to armor shielding if it connected. While this energy beam was quite powerful, there was a moment where the drones needed to unlock a safety mechanism installed into them in order to fire. While intended to prevent them from firing their beam if they were compromised and could be harmed by the energy output of their own weapon, this mode presented an opportunity to melee counter them and send them into a vulnerable stasis mode, rendering them open to attack. While these drones might not have been very large, they more than made up for this in power and numbers, rendering them a hazard worth eliminating quickly if traveling through their assigned territory and a fair fit for threat level beta. The members of the Musby family represented some of the largest and most powerful creatures on Planet ZDR, and were feared by many for good reason. Though initially small in size with a brown body as grubs, adult Musby had massive pink fleshy bodies with a large bulbous back end and small front end, where a small pair of horns and 4 red eyes could be spotted. Because they had mainly developed in the darker lower reaches of ZDR, they had not had the need to develop a true face of sorts, leaving their eyes and horns as the only obvious marker of which end of them is which. They had 4 pairs of claw-like legs, but the 2 pairs in the center appeared to be atrophied and had not been used by the creatures for some time, as they mainly just relied on their forelegs for locomotion, and the oversized back legs for both locomotion and offense. These beasts typically use their massive back ends to attack and crush smaller life forms before slurping them up into their small, almost invisible mouths, and in turn tend to fight with their back to their enemy, using backwards movement to get into position. When they were within range of a potential prey item, these beasts would use what little power they had in their forelegs to hoist their back end and legs into the air before forcefully slamming them onto their target, crushing them. This attack could be melee countered at the right time to force the beast to slouch onto their forelegs, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack, or could be avoided altogether by sliding beneath their bodies as the rear legs and behind were reared up. But if they did connect with their strike, it would do an immense amount of damage regardless. These monsters might not have had any type of armored hide to them, not really needing it as they existed as the top predators in places like Artaria as they were, but they were still resilient and could take quite a bit of punishment, making it worthwhile to confront them from afar, if not avoid them altogether, as they were fairly passive creatures if they were otherwise left alone, leaving them best classified within threat level beta. While the Musby could be a threat on its own, it is known that after X-parasites infected nearly all the life forms on Planet ZDR during the Hunter's visit to the planet, X-parasite infected versions of these creatures took on not just 1, but 3 of the possible forms. The most common was a creature known as the Goliath. While this beast imitated the exact same behavior as Musby, they are notably different in that the X-parasites had mixed genetic material from other life forms into this new beast, making it much larger than standard Musby, and additionally coating much of its body in thick grayish-green rock-like armor that was completely invulnerable to nearly all types of attack, minus the devastating damaging capabilities of a power bomb. This armor did not seem to slow them down much at all, and instead amplified their damaging power to an immense degree, rendering them a much more severe threat than before, but their forms anatomically were otherwise still effectively the same, and their front end had not been covered in armor, so it could still see its surroundings. As such, while the armored forms were too large and powerful to be melee countered, they can still be slid beneath or even moved around and above to avoid their attacks, allowing for the targeting of their vulnerable front end to defeat them, and leaving them a spot within threat level beta. The Sunap was a type of mollusk-like creature that dwelled within multiple parts of ZDR and was able to survive both in and out of the water, though it appears that they mainly preferred to live in open environments where food was more readily available to them. These creatures had a soft pink body that clung to hard surfaces with a thick, sticky secretion on the lower halves, and they had a number of sharp black claws that jutted out from the central body, acting as teeth for the creatures. On land, these beasts were not a serious threat, as they mainly fed on small organisms lured in by a pungent aroma they released that lured prey towards their mouths, where contact led to Sunap rapidly pulsing their frames to slash at said prey with their sharp teeth claws before devouring them bit by bit. This could make them relatively easy to avoid for the most part, as they could move their bodies once rooted, making them little more than an easily damaged hazard for those that didn't watch the step carefully, and thus are placed best within threat level alpha. The members of the Hecathon family were among the largest of life forms known to exist on ZDR, but while their imposing size might have made them look like serious threats, they are actually among the least aggressive life forms on the planet, and rarely ever try to attack anything near them without being attacked first. The Hecathon had large brown and green semi-flat forms, the green coloration coming from moss that naturally grew on their body, with small fin-like wings on their sides and back end, a long tapering tail, and a bulky front end with sonic detectors in their flesh that allow them to see through sound in the absence of knowable eyes. They are among the oldest of life forms on ZDR, having existed on the planet since ancient times, and were able to actually fly despite their immense size and weight because of a series of electromagnetic organs in their form, combined with light gases that fill various chambers in their body that help to repel against the earth and keep them afloat, which worked out well for them as they mainly fed on small flying insects, almost swimming through the air and turning around like a majestic whale. They tended to fly and live between trees in both high and low areas, and were very much non-aggressive, much like the Clyda of Artaria, and only attacked others if they were directly struck or otherwise fired at from an opposing party first. If this was done, however, they could potentially be a serious threat, as these monsters were capable of using large holes in their back hide to generate and release a purple energy ray that swept over anything below them with a sinister purple light. This powerful energy ray would actually break down objects with intense radiation and cause mass cellular death and degradation in metal, effectively decomposing anything that was directly below them, and in turn both neutralizing potential threats below them, and possibly providing a meal that their otherwise small mouths could handle. Because they were extremely durable and there was no way to counter this damaging ray, it was best to leave these beasts alone and simply move past them, as it would show no intent to cause harm to others so long as they were left alone, and fit comfortably therefore within threat level beta.
Damn, they sure as hell know how to make them damn big around here, don't they? Jokes on size aside, these monsters were a hell of a sight to see, and more than deserving of a little space. They sort of look like space whales to a weird extent, and those massive bodies can in turn take a hell of a lot of punishment. Thankfully, you were honestly better off just leaving them be with most of this, as it really only could cause harm with the powerful radiation beam they can use to zap anything and everything that gets a bit too close to them. They're a hell of a lot more peaceful than a lot of people really give them credit for being, and it's a damn shame we couldn't ever manage to find one before they went extinct. Though on reflection, not sure we would actually have the room for one anyways.
Central Unit served as the backbone for the system used by Ravenbeak and Quiet Robe on Planet ZDR to take control of the numerous enemy robots that were sent by the Galactic Federation to explore ZDR after the transmission there hinted at the possibility of X-parasites still being alive in the known universe. These machines, normally housed in a stasis pod where they remained in sleep mode until the presence of a foreign life form in an enemy zone alerted them into action, were directly modeled after Mother Brain and controlled the behavioral programming of the enemy robots as much as she did with the Metroids on Zebes prior to its destruction, and in turn made them critical for the Hunter in her efforts to escape and ultimately destroy the enemy robots that pursued her on her adventure through the planet. They were made to only operate within specially designated enemy zones, as a strong signal was needed to keep the advanced enemy robots under control, and that distance can only be extended so far away from the central unit, depending upon the structure and composition of surrounding rooms and facilities. These creatures consisted of a large blue brain-like body with a single blue eye that is typically fitted with some sort of silver blue plated armor to protect both brain and eye. This is because, unlike Mother Brain, their smaller forms were more vulnerable to the effects of energy weapons and could in turn be damaged by any type of conventional weapon system on their own. This armor was quite sturdy, but it could be damaged with concussive blasts from missile weaponry, though this does not mean that they were going to simply remain in place without responding to any sort of attack. Since these creatures were not armed with any sort of firepower on their own, they used electromagnets in their internal frame to float in the air and out of reach for most of the native life forms of ZDR, and they are typically contained within rooms that possess both energy turrets that fired thin laser beams for offense, colored to match the enemy that a given central unit was connected to, as well as advanced Rinka generators, whose projectiles were still moving, but could only be really destroyed with charged beam shots, concussive weaponry, and damaging movement systems like the screw attack. If a central unit sustained enough damage to its armored shell, it would break and expose its body to attack, but this would also trigger an aggression protocol built into its room, causing the weapon systems attached to the walls of the chamber to start firing shots at a faster pace. Still, this is not enough to make them a noble threat to others on their own, and are best placed within threat level beta. While it is known that the destruction of central units did trigger an immediate warning spike in the connected enemy robot, with each unit being assigned to control one specific enemy robot within an area, and in turn alerted said robots to the position of the creatures that last entered into the room, it also proved to be a necessity for the Hunter in order to defeat the enemy robots in the first place. Central units were powered by an immensely strong nuclear energy force that existed as a more contained, easier to manage variant of the energy featured in the Chozo Hyper Beam used by Mother Brain and the Hunter herself in the last confrontation. When a central unit was destroyed, it made it possible for those with Chozo-based armor and weapon systems to temporarily absorb this immense energy to activate the Chozo Omega Cannon and its associated firing modes. This firepower was the only thing capable of destabilizing the defenses of an enemy robot and ultimately destroying them, so it proved to be essential for the Hunter to find and destroy these creatures as she came across them, ultimately using their power to destroy 6 of the 7 enemy robots posted on ZDR, the last of which was killed out of sight through direct absorption of energy from the Hunter against the strongest of the enemy robot models. The Obsidomethan were a type of living stone creature that seemed to have little in the way of organic tissue, instead being powered and animated by a condensed energy core that not only kept them from being frozen by the extreme heat found in many parts of Artaria and especially Cataris, the only sections of Planet ZDR where they actually thrived, but also seemed to grant them unusual magnetic properties, with bits of rock levitating around their main body while they were active. These creatures dwelled near magma pools and usually remained still in an ore-like form, using the energy core to sustain themselves as the body was pointed directly downwards towards the ground and the limbs bunched together, and if it were not for the valuable ores contained within their body, they likely would not be bothered by anything. However, they are an essential diet for some of the larger, more dangerous denizens of Cataris in particular, so they had forced themselves to develop to combat such threats. When they detected some sort of life form approaching them, these creatures would rotate the ovoid bodies in the air towards the approaching target, deploying 4 pointed parrot-like legs, and would charge up energy before releasing it in the form of a powerful blast wave of pure thermal energy for defense. This attack was very powerful and could pass through solid walls, making them a dangerous obstacle to confront in any situation, but this attack could be halted with a melee counter, leaving them open to counterattack. This may have been the best way to handle these beasts, as the hard rocky shells otherwise kept them well armored against most types of conventional weaponry, with only charged energy bursts and concussive weaponry otherwise being capable of destroying them and removing them from one's path, and thus clearly belong within threat level beta.
Man, I tell you, it feels like everything in the blade was just woke up the dead. Even the blade rock stays safe. It's hot and wave, ready to strike and plus anything that gets close with fire and rock. Shit's unreal, I tell you. I was looking at it look pretty damn cool, not gonna deny that. That's just a hell of a lot here that I would quite get. A lot of it just don't sit right in the eye, but next thing you know, plants will. No, get that? The energy will. Yeah, no, freeze on. That's correct. Next thing you know, ships will be piling themselves in. Now, I did that too. Now I'm in trouble.
The Chozo soldiers served as the bread and butter of the Chozo warrior race, and existed as a relic of a time in the past where the Chozo were once the dominant fighting force in the known galaxy and possibly beyond. Trained in the way of close quarters fighting and masters of the double-ended spear weapon they specialize in, these fighters were clad in Chozo battle armor of Mochan design, and were able to use it to repel weaker foes and make short work of anyone that dared to try and get in their way. At the time of the Hunter's arrival on Planet ZDR, all the native Mochan Chozo soldiers had been killed off, but this was not the end of them, as some powerful ex-parasites managed to take full control over the bodies and minds of a few soldiers without them turning into Chozo zombies, enabling them to retain the natural fighting prowess and power of those they infected. Standard Chozo soldiers were quick on their feet and would slowly approach a given target until they can get in close, twirling the weapon a bit before going in for a slashing stab attack with it. If their opponent was trying to keep their distance, however, they would instead use a natural athletic strength to leap into the air towards them, assisted by boosters in their back armor, before cutting their boosters and stabbing the area below them with great force, hoping to impale their target. This seemingly simple attack pattern could be blamed on the limited control that ex-parasites had over the bodies of these beasts, and if they sustained noticeable damage, the parasite would effectively lose its patience and deform the host's body, the head and neck splitting open horizontally to reveal a gooey inner maw and in turn give away the fact that they were merely parasites in disguise. Once this change occurred, they would become much more aggressive and would lunge forward with their spear with little presentation in close quarters, an attack that had a longer reach than normal and thus could close the distance between them and a target more readily. In addition, instead of homing in on the target with a leaping attack, they would opt to leap and stab the ground between them and their target, sending out a wave of toxic sludge on each side of them in the hopes of tripping up their opponent. Once these monsters had sustained critical damage, they would attempt to deal direct damage to their target in close quarters without properly guarding themselves. A successful pair of melee counters at this point could be used to stun them and leave their maws open to a charged beam blast to finish them off. While standard Chozo soldiers could be a pain to deal with, it is also noted that there was an elite variety of this enemy that was notably stronger in that they carried a shield with them. Standard shields could be destroyed either with repeated fire from concussive missile weapons or ripped away if they attempted to charge forward with their shield, though it is noted that even here, the gold elite Chozo soldiers were gifted with shields that could not be destroyed with normal weapons, requiring them to be torn apart with grapple beam technology to expose the wielder to attack. In addition, when they entered a rampaging state, they could use advanced spider magnet technology to cling to walls and fire out a series of beams of irradiated sludge. They would track their targets with this attack and fire wherever their target was standing at less than a second before they fire, making it hard to dodge the attack without careful attention and precise dodging maneuvers. Altogether, standard or elite, Chozo soldiers more than showed the battle prowess that allowed the Chozo to rise up as a warrior race and conquer the galaxy in ancient times, and it is more than apparent that their training has not let up at all since then, earning a solid spot within threat level Gamma.
It's an incredibly rare opportunity to be able to see an actual Chozo warrior in action, and while the hunter may have done well in being able to beat them, I still find it fascinating to go through her visual logs over and over again just to see her fighting against them. The swiftness of their movements and the sharpness of their spears meant that they could often be masters of melee combat, and in an age where energy weapons and the like are the go-to usually, it's a breath of fresh air and really speaks to the honor they have towards themselves and the work they dedicate their lives to. Sadly though, as much praise as I can give to the nimble footwork, their armor wasn't perfect, and the ex-parasite copies that are present during the hunter's journey on ZDR were nasty mockeries. that dropped their guys as soon as the health started to dip down too far, using their sludgy bodies to amplify the range and power of their attacks. It's a shame to see these proud warriors mutated into horrible monsters, but the X rarely ever chose to keep honor and heart intact in their transformations and creations.
The Gobbler was an unusual native on Planet ZDR that bore a striking resemblance to the Ghidorah and its relatives in terms of growth cycle and preferred habitats, but otherwise differed notably in having a much more active lifestyle and an anatomical form that reflected that. These creatures start out as small, spore-like nymphs that attach themselves to the energy shield on a door and feed off it directly for energy. Over the course of a few hours, these monsters would sap increasing amounts of energy from the door shield and grow continuously in size as they did so, using the main structure of the door itself as a fixture to grasp and grow over until they eventually covered it completely, sometimes spreading their cellular growth over onto the walls, floor, and ceiling nearby. As a fully formed adult, the Gobbler possessed a thick, spiny, rock-like black hide that could be damaging to come into contact with, though few would get the chance to touch that part of the body for long. The Gobbler also possessed a single massive eye, which it used to quietly observe other creatures that came towards it. The eye was the only part of their forms that was vulnerable to attack, but instead of just trying to close it, these creatures had a series of claw-like limbs around the base of their eye that would cover the eye like armor when they felt threatened, allowing them to still see without being vulnerable to direct damage. As noted, these creatures were a lot more active than Ghidorah, as they did possess a small digestive system and were predatory in nature. They tended to make their homes on hatches that led to the nests of powerful monsters, though the exact reason why is not currently known, and when something got too close to them, the monsters would use a massive hidden pouch of elastic flesh to launch their bodies outwards, attacking with a powerful eye headbutt, claws extended, to violently pierce their target in the hopes of impaling vital organs and getting their prey stuck in their claws, where they died and then were slowly digested by tiny acid-emitting holes in the tips of their claws, enabling the Gobbler to melt their meals and slowly ingest them through osmosis into the hide and the tissue of their eyes, strangely enough. While Gobblers could take a decent amount of punishment with basic weaponry, and carefully cover their eyes as they slowly retreated back to an alert resting state if they missed an attack, they also shook increasingly so as a potential meal got closer to them and with a notable tail right before lunging outward, making it possible to melee counter them and render them vulnerable enough to be destroyed instantly with only a minor amount of firepower. While they might not have been a serious threat to those that knew how to handle them, they could still prove to be a noble hazard to deal with without the right strategic counters, and occupy a solid niche within threat level beta. Scorpions were extremely dangerous, violent creatures that made their home within the jungle-like environments of Gavoron on Planet ZDR typically, but they weren't known to be able to adapt to any sort of environment and in turn could live even within the colder reaches of Artaria, where the hunter confronted one on her journey through the planet. These beasts had large, blue-skinned bodies with a pair of arm-like forms that ended in a series of sharp spike-like claws and possessed no lower half to their body, their torsos ending abruptly with a pointed fleshy end and would look to be rib-like spikes jutting out from its surface. It is unknown currently if this was the norm for its kind, as only one was recorded to be seen alive on ZDR. Their head was formed from what looked to be twisted ridges of beige flesh, with a reddened neck base and a series of yellow eyes on their faces situated between these ridges. Their mouths were lined with small, sharp teeth that allowed them to dine on a number of different creatures, and even if they could not fight their prey directly, these creatures could inflate the throat sac to spit out globs of acid and undigested food as makeshift projectiles, though they could be destroyed for energy and ammunition, and could even spew a toxic ground-hugging acidic gas that could make it hard to get close to them. The most prominent feature, however, was easily their large tail, which resembled that of a scorpion in form and was both elastic and tipped with a very large, hard, spiny stinger that could be used to smash into opponents to deliver damage through its spiky form, or by impaling a target. Though this latter attack could leave their tail stuck in soft ground, leaving their face, the only truly vulnerable part of their body, open to attack. Scorpions on their own have strong hides and could only be truly harmed by attacking their face, and were smart enough to know how to flip their bodies horizontally to directly slam their tails onto targets and keep the head protected from harm, though the stance they took in this state could make it possible to slide beneath their raised bodies to get to their face, and while they could initiate a quick counter to try and repel frontal attacks following this maneuver, this too could be melee countered to set them off a bit and make it possible to dodge their attacks for a short while to deal immense damage to them repeatedly. What made the one that the hunter confronted different, however, was the fact that it had managed to swallow a chosen artifact, namely the Phantom Cloak, and was not able to fully remove it from its system, the device getting lodged in its tail as it passed through the beast's digestive system. Instead of this acting as a problem though, the specimen was able to bond organically with the system and used it to cloak itself and turn invisible when it felt threatened. However, activation of the power resulted in the device glowing brightly as a bulge in the beast's tail, and it could be forced to deactivate with sustained gunfire to the visible device, and thus force the creature back into a phase where direct damage could be dealt to it. Eventually, the hunter was able to deal critical damage to the creature's skull, and in a last-ditch effort to kill her, it charged straight at her with its body and tail, only for the hunter to dodge out of the way while the beast collided with and destroyed the Chozo statue it had taken the upgrade from in the first place, finally expiring and allowing her to extract the phantom cloak from its corpse. As a whole, these monsters could be a genuine terror to face, and were more than smart enough to corner even the most agile of prey, and use their awkward forms to pressure them and make sure they had little room to avoid their attacks in, making this horrible fiend best placed within threat level Gamma.
Oh hell yeah! Now this is the kind of beast I'd love to tangle with. On their own, these ugly-ass monsters could be a hell of a thing to encounter, using their sharp-bladed tails and acidic saliva and gum to attack others from afar without them needing to get all that close to their prey. I know a lot of their attack patterns could be baited in their head, wasn't as well protected against attack compared to the rest of their body. That just makes it a fun game of cat and mouse, to bide one's time and fire away at their softer head as much as possible. I will say that the hunter definitely had a tougher fight than most would against this one in particular, since it swallowed an Aeon ability cube. Being able to turn invisible could give it an edge and sneak up on enemies. Of course, it also did a good job of revealing a core weak point in its tail that she was able to exploit to take the beast down. So I guess those Aeon abilities can come with a bit of a secondary edge if you don't know how to use them right.
Not only was Artaria the deepest part of ZDR that was at least habitable, but it was also one of the safer locales for most to visit, though given the presence of some powerful monsters here at the time of the hunter's arrival, this was not always the case, especially after the zone was effectively infected with X-parasites. Before that, the biota here were actually fairly manageable, and could be dealt with if one had decent firepower on them while exploring, and thus it could be a nice place to just relax and observe the gorgeous deer and waterfalls that filled the background of the location. However, once the X-parasites were released from Elon, everything took a turn for the worse, and it became the home for larger, more powerful mutated threats, and even resurrected Chozo soldiers. As such, while it may have started out as a fairly calm place to explore, it would eventually become a bit of a nightmare to have to traverse, and only remotely safe for those that had protection against the X and strong armor to resist the damaging strikes of the beast that came to dwell within its otherwise quiet, calm passageways and caverns. If you're a fan of spelunking in all of its forms, then Artaria would have been the place for you, and it is a shame that it was eventually rendered a land unfit for most to survive in, but don't let that get in the way of enjoying ZDR's waters. That is especially the case for us, as next we will be taking a dive into the submerged underwater caverns where most of the planet's water reserves were kept, as we next take a look at the mostly underwater world of Berenia. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.